Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to have a conversation with an old friend of mine from Washington, D.C., Josh Rogin. Many of you will know Josh from his stints on CNN. He's a political analyst with CNN, but also from reading his tremendous insights in the Washington Post. Josh is a columnist for the global opinion section of the Post. And has had a storied career in journalism thus far in Washington, D.C. I had early opportunities to work together with Josh as he was working on Japan issues. Josh is one of those people who started out among the small coterie of Asia specialists with time at Sophia University in Japan, working for the Asahi Shimbun, and then obviously went on and left the rest of us behind and went on to broader, bigger, and more global things. But Josh, is delighted to have a conversation with you today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Gordon. You know, you were such a help to me in those years that you were in Washington to help me climb the learning curve on all of these important issues. So it's really an honor to be invited to speak with you today.
Well, today we're going to be talking about Josh's book, and I don't have a hard copy. I've just got my Kindle version. Josh has a remarkable new book out that's caused quite a stir. It's called Chaos Under Heaven: Trump, Xi, and the Battle for the 21st Century. Just last month, our sister organization, the United States Studies Center, had a wonderful public discussion with John Lee and Josh and several others. And I watched that with tremendous interest. I've seen probably 3 or 4 other book launches, if you will. And given the fact that the Perth US Asia Center has a growing community, not just here in Western Australia, but Australia more broadly and throughout the Indo-Pacific, I thought it would be useful for us to have a deeper conversation about recent developments in China, in U.S.-China relations, how that might impact Australia, and of course, all of that viewed through the context of your wonderful book, Josh. Thank you so much. Let's kick off with the title. You in the forward there quote, whether it's an actual quote or not is debatable, but a quote from Mao Zedong attributed to him says, "There is great chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent." Can you kind of give us a little bit of an overview of the book, why you decided to write it, and your framing of the book?
Sure. Well, as you noted, the quote from Mao is not actually, we're not even sure that he actually said it, but I think you aptly described sort of a key element of the Trump administration as it turned towards a more competitive and eventually more confrontational strategy vis-a-vis China. And that was that, you know, from top to bottom, inside and out, left to right, up to down, it was total chaos, pretty much. From the jump, from the beginning, from Trump Tower during the transition, when in the opening scene of my book, Yang Jiechi travels to New York at the invitation of Jared Kushner and meets with Trump officials and lectures them in private in a very similar way to which he lectured the Biden administration officials 4 years later in public. And what he got back from the other side was a total mishmash of competing ideas, factional infighting, and that was just the beginning. The first major scandal of the Trump presidency happened during the transition when President-elect Trump took a call from Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, and that set the U.S.-China relationship on a negative trajectory before the Trump administration even started. And as I detail in the book, Trump didn't understand what he was doing, and his staff hadn't warned him that this was going to be seen as the biggest scandal in U.S.-China relations in 40 years. And he was very angry, and it soured him on Taiwan for years after that. And, you know, when the administration came in, it didn't get any better. And, you know, I identified different camps inside the administration. You had sort of the hawks, the super hawks from the campaign. These were people like Bannon and Navarro and Stephen Miller and Robert Spalding. And they wanted to just bring down the CCP or whatever they thought was the equivalent of that. And then you had the hardliners, which are people like Mike Pence and Matt Pottinger and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. And they wanted to reset the relationship and not destroy it for the fun of it. And then you had the Wall Street clique led by Stephen Mnuchin and Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn and Larry Kudlow. And they were advancing the pro-business engagement position. And then, of course, you had, you know, the people in the bureaucracy who had been working on these issues for a lot of years and distrusted a Trump administration that was overly politicizing the China issue at every turn. And when you put all of that together with a president who, you know, thought he knew a lot about China and had some firm views on China that he brought into his presidency from 30 years of writing about China, or at least having people write books in his name about that included mentions of China, and his personal relationship with Xi Jinping, which he considered to be very close and had various effects on U.S. policy over the course of the term. it was just a disaster. And, that's not to say some good things didn't happen. Of course, many bad things happened. It was a roller coaster, a seesaw. But the one thing that was always constant is that confusion went all the way to the top. And even the people inside the system didn't know which way was up on any given day. And, that had to redound to the Chinese government's benefit as it sought to maneuver and as it sought to influence the administration. Of course, it didn't work in the end, but we can get into why the Chinese government flubbed this opportunity to seize upon Trump administration's chaos, but that's another part of the story.
Well, look, I had to say, having had read through it, your book is really the best and probably most searing account of the chaos of China policy during the Trump administration itself, but it also puts it in a broader historical context. I mean, real or not, there's no question that Mao did use chaos and uncertainty as a governing strategy, right? And just look at the Great Leap Forward, you look at the Cultural Revolution, and you fast forward to the United States over the last 4 years. There was something of a strategy about just keeping the media, the government, your own administration off guard by just kind of purveying chaos everywhere you went. And so it seems to be kind of a mirror image of different periods of time in terms of the overall policy. Let me get into something specific before we move on. At the very first section of your book, you describe the awakening, and not a religious awakening, but just kind of all the different people you interviewed during the course of the preparing for the book, how they, one time or other, had a series of awakenings. Number one, recognition that the U.S.-China relationship was probably the biggest issue of the era, the most important relationship of the era. And you and I, both having worked for a long time in Japan, know that it took us probably a decade to get away from the Mansfield mantra. For our viewers who don't know Mike Mansfield was the former U.S. ambassador to Japan, former U.S. Senate Majority Leader, and for 15 years I ran the Mansfield Foundation. While Josh was living in Japan and then working on Japan, we all took great comfort in this mantra. When Mike Mansfield was ambassador in Tokyo, he said, the U.S.-Japan relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And then he added this Western phrase, bar none. And all of a sudden, we entered this era where over the last decade, it became increasingly apparent that China as a relationship was actually more important. Now, obviously, it wasn't the best relationship, but it's certainly more important. That was one level of awakening. The second one, obviously, was, if I described it correctly, you said, awakening to the aggressive and malign character, behavior, and strategy of China's leadership, the CCP, the Communist Party. And so I'm curious if you would describe your own awakening on China, which I presume influenced your decision to write this book at this time.
Right. So, I mean, overall, this is the thing that the China hands in Washington take issue with the most. What they'll say after reading my book is, oh, we've been following these issues for 40 years or longer. We always knew that these were problems that the American foreign policy establishment was having to deal with in one way or the other. And, that this idea of an awakening is a false idea. But the point of the book is not to say that the China hands in Washington had some sort of awakening. Quite the contrary. The point is that all of a sudden the issue of China's the U.S.-China relationship and the Chinese government's strategy and behavior and actions, mostly outside of its own borders, became apparent and problematic for people who are not working in the field of U.S.-China relations. And that's the point, is that all of a sudden, slowly but surely, I would say over the course of 20 years, basically since we granted China PNTR status in 2000 and then it joined the WTO the following year, China's increasing internal repression, external aggression, interference in free and open societies, and overall, efforts to what we like to say, sort of change the world order that we built by using our engagement to advance their interests against ours, to put it, in a simple way, dawned on different parts of the U.S. government that weren't already involved in the U.S.-China debate. And we're talking about first the law enforcement community, the national security community. Eventually, this awakening happened in all sectors of U.S. society, in academia, in Wall Street, in sports, in Hollywood, in Silicon Valley. And, for me, when I started as a cub reporter for the Asahi Shimbun in 2004, already I detected a lot of people who, again, were not China hands, who were coming to the stark realization that the U.S.-China relationship was not something that could be confined to the China hands, frankly, and that all of a sudden all these various interests were being affected. And then over the course of 2007, 2008, as I moved to Congressional Quarterly, I saw different pockets in Congress get very active on the China issue for a variety of different reasons. And then as the Clinton administration the Obama administration came in, and Hillary Clinton came to the State Department, there was an effort to pivot to Asia, and it didn't always go very well, but it was a realization and an acknowledgement that the U.S. foreign policy, that the aircraft carrier that is U.S. foreign policy had to move. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially in the dysfunction that has consumed Washington for all these years. And then when Xi Jinping became president, this, first couple of years was the end of the Obama administration, was a period of great internal struggle inside the U.S. government over how to deal with a new regime in Beijing that was seeming to turn away from the essential bet that Washington had made, which was, again, boiling it down, that if we engaged as much as possible and integrated China into our systems as much as possible, that it would liberalize economically, and that would in turn cause it to liberalize politically, and that would in turn solve all the rest of our problems, and we would live in peaceful coexistence. Now, what's interesting is, Gordon, is that back then in 2003 or 2004, when I started covering this, there were a lot of people who said that engagement, and again, I'm boiling it down for the purposes of this conversation because the China hand community is by no means a monolith, but the engagement focused crowd said that that was mostly the responsible thing to do, and we had to give China the chance to become more like us, but eventually they just decided to go a different way. And you will even find people like Professor Nye at Harvard who will say the US-Japan focus was the hedge to prepare us against if the bet didn't go our way. And that's what the alliance structure that they were building on a parallel track was all about. You will find a lot of people in 2021 who will still say that that's the only responsible course of action, and that this turn towards competition and confrontation is foolish and dangerous. And that's an argument that I think we have to sort of engage as a legitimate argument, but it happens to be one that I disagree with. But the bottom line is that over the course of the 4 years of the Trump administration, what happened is that the different parts of American society started to discuss this problem that they were having with the Chinese government's actions, again, not inside China, inside of our borders. And, that discussion was happening inside of academia, on US campuses, inside of Silicon Valley, inside these companies, actually, and then on Wall Street. And when the US government, interacted with these institutions, and American institutions like Australian institutions defend their independence very fiercely and rightly. So when the FBI came and knocking on the door and said, hey, we got to talk about the national security concerns of your engagement with China, it didn't go well. And these institutions didn't appreciate the Trump administration butting into their business, and mistakes were made. And the Trump administration, because it was such a mess, often bungled these interactions. But the bottom line was that over the course of 2017, 2018, and 2019, all of these various institutions were waking up to the idea that, all of a sudden, we can't ignore the fact that some Confucius institutes are used for malign activity and some aren't. And, some investment in the U.S. tech sector has a national security implication, and some doesn't. And some Wall Street funding of Chinese companies that build the cameras that sit atop the concentration camp walls is problematic, and other investment isn't. And then the pandemic hit, okay? And this was the end of the awakening, because at that by that time, all doubt was removed from the minds of every American, and not only every American, every citizen of the world who's sitting in their basement, who can't see their grandmother, who's scared to death of getting the coronavirus, who realizes instantly to what degree we can debate that the Chinese Communist Party and its behavior and its actions and its strategy had an effect on their lives, contributed in some way. Again, we can debate how much, but more than zero exacerbated their suffering. And what happened in Beijing and Wuhan didn't stay in Beijing and Wuhan. And now this was a problem that all countries had to deal with. And that was the sort of last part of the awakening. You saw countries everywhere, not just Australia, which had been dealing with these issues for so many years, but England and the Netherlands and, you name it, just coming to the realization that, wait a second, we got a problem here. And that's where we are. Now everyone agrees that there's a problem, and now we have to figure out what we're going to do about it.
I think in some ways you're more charitable than I am towards the China studies community, because in the end, I would never consider myself a China specialist, but I have
Me
had
neither.
30 odd trips to 40 odd cities in China, most provinces, and worked on it for the better part of 20 odd years. And there's no question that 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, the consensus view of China and our appropriate strategies for China are quite different. And here in Australia, there is actually a really sharp divide pre-Xi, post-Xi, right? So if you were in government, working on, particularly if you were in politics pre-Xi Jinping, your views of China are very different than if you're in government or working on China or in politics and working on China post Xi Jinping. It's just a fundamentally different. So the question really is how much has China changed in that regard?
Sure.
But you get into that in tremendous detail in your book.
I would just say one thing to that, Gordon, is that, the way I describe it in my book in Washington is a generational turnover, and for the young China hands and the young Asia hands, that bet on that engaging with China would produce these fantastic results. A bet that the West had no means to enforce once the help was proffered, didn't matter to us. The younger China hands weren't invested in that because we hadn't been around when the bet was made. So we bore no allegiance to it one way or the other. So if someone were to come to tell us that, well, we have to continue with this engagement strategy because that's the basis of our life work, we would say, no, that's not the basis of our life work. That's the older generation protecting their mistakes and their access and their continued ability to control the discussion. But, what a lot of people in the Trump administration were trying to do is to, expand the Overton window of policy options. And the only way to do that was to bring more people into the conversation and to realize that, hey, we have to have a Treasury Department that's smart on China. We have to have a Commerce Department that's smart. Wait, we have to have an Education Department that's smart on China. Wait, we have to have an Energy Department that was smart on China. And okay, well, yes, we still want the China hands and the NSC and the State Department to do what they're doing, but they're going to have to yield some of the discussion over to all of these other interests, because these interests, and Congress, by the way, represent these parts of American society that are demanding a response from their government.
Well, again, we're going to get back to Australia a couple of minutes ago too, but obviously in your previous discussion, you've outlined the need to have an NBA that's smarter on China. And now we have to have barley farmers and cray fishermen who are smart on China as well. So we're going to get to that in some detail. Let me go back to your book. It's funny, when the initial meeting between Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan took place about a little over a month ago in Alaska, in Anchorage. A lot of the reporting was, again, needing of your longer term perspective, kind of missed the history and reported this as this is the first time it's ever happened that Yang Jiechi has done a Khrushchev moment and taken his shoe off and banged on the table and harangued the U.S. delegation. In your book, you actually start off by detailing an almost identical kind of experience early in the Trump administration. So I wonder, as a segue into 2 points we're going to talk about in a little bit, Trump policy and then Biden policy, if you would compare those two opening contacts between the Trump administration you detail in your book and Anchorage, and kind of pull out any similarities or differences you think that our audience should pay attention to.
Yeah, sure. I think the things that we need to think about are that, first of all, as you said, the message that Yang Jiechi delivered to the Trump team in the transition, and then to the Biden team in Anchorage, were the exact same messages, almost verbatim, almost word for word. I mean, there was a little updated stuff on Xinjiang and attacking America for its race relations, etc. But essentially, the Chinese position has been stay out of our stuff. We want a new model of great power relations. That means you can't criticize us. That means you treat us as equals, and stay out of all of our core interests, whatever they may be, and tell everybody in your country to do the same. Now, that pitch was the original pitch that Xi Jinping gave to Obama during their first meeting in October 2013, and it's still the pitch today. The difference, of course, was that in Anchorage, they said it out loud, okay? And now the fact that they said it out loud, and the Biden team, I thought, did the only thing they could do, which is to stand their ground without being too, jerkish about it, right? They said what they wanted to say. They didn't yield any of their positions, including on Uyghur genocide or what have you. But they didn't seek to inflame tensions. That was a Rorschach test in Washington. If you were a Republican and you wanted to criticize Biden, you would say, "Oh, Biden screwed the pooch because he got yelled at by the Chinese and then he didn't do enough to stand up for it." And if you wanted to support the Biden administration, you say, "Oh, well, they really stood up for human rights in a way that the Trump administration never did." And I could argue either way, but the big difference here is that the Chinese government is now saying the things out loud that they used to say only in private. And there's only two there's really only two ways to interpret that. Either they're feeling a lot more insecure or they're feeling a lot more confident, right? And, we can say that both of these delegations in Anchorage were speaking back to their home audiences, right? And of course, the Biden team doesn't want to get outflanked on the right about China. They don't want to. They'd rather be called too hawkish on China than too weak on China. That's a reflection of American politics, because they can read the polls and they know that Americans sitting in their basements who can't see grandma, who are scared to death of getting the coronavirus, want more and aggressive actions to counteract Chinese strategies of all kinds. But on the Chinese side, if Yang Jiechi is speaking to his audience of one to Xi Jinping, what does that tell us? That tells us, they're doubling down on all their strategies, and that despite all of our efforts, they haven't actually done the thing that we want them to do, which is to think twice about all of these bad actions, starting with the Uyghur genocide and going down from there. Now, again, the point of the Trump administration strategy was the frame of it, at least from the hardliners' perspective, and I explained in the book why the hardliners' view won out, was that we're going to change our behavior to put the Beijing to a choice. And their choice is they can respond to the legitimate and real concerns of the international community on a range of issues, or they can pay an ever-increasing cost. And right now, they're paying the cost. They seem to have noticed that they're paying a cost. They seem not to like it, but they haven't backed down. And, I don't know, because I think to some degree the inner workings of the top layers of the CCP are unknowable, but it seems to me that this could be a reflection of the fact that the dissent mechanisms inside the top of the CCP leadership are not functioning the way that they ought to. And maybe Yang Jiechi doesn't have the option of not yelling back at Blinken. And maybe, we're actually, that's an escalation ladder that we have to think about as we conduct our policy. But at the same time, what we're seeing from the Biden administration is a lot of continuity. And that's an effort to show both the CCP and Americans that we're not going to go back to the 2016 or 2013 policy of engagement-focused interactions with the CCP, because it didn't work, and we just can't try that again.
Well, thank you. You're very insightful. I had, in my own reactions to Anchorage, had come to a very similar conclusion to you, that Yang Jiechi in particular was speaking to an audience of one back in China.
Sure.
Wang Yi obviously had a little bit more latitude to be a little bit less strident, both I think probably in inclination and positioning within the party. But I had kind of concluded that the United States was speaking to the world. I really hadn't thought through what you just said, which is quite correct, that given the change polity in the United States, they were also speaking to an American political audience there too.
Of course.
So,
and if you,
very, very helpful. Yeah.
If you think about it, inside the Biden administration, they have the same divisions on China that they had inside the Obama administration, because they have the very exact same people, the same exact people. Now, that's not to say that all of these people are in the same place that they were. If you listen to what Susan Rice and John Kerry say in 2021, it's quite different than it was in 2016, but it's not the same as what Tony Blinken says on China. Now, the competitors like Tony Blinken and to an extent Jake Sullivan have the ball. They have control of the policy because of what we just talked about, because the politics are on their side. And I've noticed, reporting on the first few months of the Biden administration's China policy, that anytime they're put to the test of, do you want to take the hawkish or dovish position, they take the hawkish one if at all possible, because that's in Joe Biden's political incentive. But the problem is that the battles haven't actually played out yet, and the dangle hasn't come. The president of the United States hasn't been put to a choice between Kerry's climate change deal and Tony Blinken's insistence that we have to be tough against the Uyghurs. And of course, what John Kerry will say is that we're not going to fall for that linkage. We're not going to fall for that linkage. But if you read my book, that's what the Trump people said. We're not going to fall for that linkage. And then they fell for it over and over and over again, until the president of the United States was like, oh, well, I guess we can get a bad trade deal if you give us something on North Korea, yielding to the linkage in such a stupid way that it actually gave Xi Jinping a reason to never solve the North Korea problem, because he could have dangled it over Trump's head forever, which is exactly what he did. So Joe Biden is like that, right? He thinks like that. For him, when push comes to shove, he'll have to make a decision between his two staffers, Tony Blinken and John Kerry. But I think that test really hasn't shown itself.
Well, perfect segue. I wanted to just, again, and I realize it's a really difficult task to sum big 4-year long period of times or project forward in short kind of pithy statements. But again, your book is probably the best blow-by-blow account of China policy over the Trump years that has come out to date. My own personal view is that the Trump administration was very long on attitude and very short on strategy. There have been some attempts to rectify that perception. I think in the waning days of the Trump administration, there was a lot of head scratching here in Canberra on a decision signed off by then National Security Advisor Robert C. O'Brien to lay out this China strategy document. In retrospect, for those who are doing a little inside baseball, it seems to be burnishing the legacy of Matt Pottinger and others to let the people know that despite the chaos, there actually was a strategy. There were people who understand strategically. But can you help our audience just kind of walk through what are the 2 or 3 points that we need to most understand about the 4 years of the Trump administration policy towards and strategy towards China, and ultimately where do we stand at the end of Trump? And then we'll get back to Biden in a minute.
Sure. Basically, what I think the strategy documents show is that there was at least one faction inside the Trump administration that was thinking about these things from day one. And as I detail, the strategy that Robert O'Brien and Pottinger released in January 2020 was amazingly similar to the document that Pottinger had on his computer that he brought into the White House on day one in 2016. He called it Bill's paper, which was like, a bit of subterfuge because he thought that if someone was searching his computer, they wouldn't notice it. But basically what it was a 12-page memo that was entitled A Rebalance of Power in Asia. And it was an argument and an outline for how to correct what Pottinger at that time saw as a relationship between the U.S. and China and the rest of the world, especially China and Asia, that had gone out of whack, and that China's increasing repression, aggression, interference in free and open societies and malign actions of all kinds had not been properly responded to, primarily by the U.S. government. And here was a basic framework of how to address that. And, the newspapers cover the Bannon versus Navarro versus Gary Cohn versus Rob Portman versus Reince Priebus, because that was the thing that all the reporters were pointed at, because that's what most Washington reporters do, is you cover the 12 or 15 people who are the most powerful people in Washington, and that's the game. But the seeds of what was going on, what eventually became the strategy in 2020 inside the administration, were planted early on, and nobody really noticed. And that's not to say that the strategy documents ran the policy. That's not what happened. But what Pottinger was doing is he was fighting two battles. He was trying to, influence the politics above him, but also fight the bureaucracy below him. And he was trying to socialize all of these ideas and basic ideas like, what is the United Front? And what is Chinese influence operations? And, how does all this stuff work? And, what do we have to do to think about China's economic aggression in a holistic sense? And, what do we have to do to think about an Indo-Pacific strategy that focuses on those frontline states? He always said that that first island chain and second island chain was where the America should put all of its resources. And he said, don't think of China like the sun, think of it as like Jupiter, one important planet in a complicated solar system that we really had to focus our attention and resources on our allies and partners in Asia, and especially Southeast Asia. Now, of course, what's funny about that is Trump didn't believe that at all. He didn't give a crap about alliances, and he actually undermined alliances at every chance he got. And his strategy was always focused on Xi Jinping solely. So he didn't listen to Pottinger at all. But meanwhile, unbeknownst to Trump, there was a lot going on inside the system. And what this did was it sort of empowered every sort of China hawk in every corner and nook and cranny of the federal government who had been losing their battles for 20 years to all of a sudden have a document to point to say, no, we have to take this action, or we have to kick this up to the policy committee meeting or whatever. And that had various effects at various stages. Now, again, the problem was that, Trump, while he had a firm view of what he wanted to do, which was to get a deal, and he didn't care about human rights, but he did care about trade, etc., he constantly changed his mind about the tactics. And he had no understanding of how to actually do anything, much less negotiate with the Chinese. And he trusted his billionaire friends, and Jared trusted their billionaire interlocutors, and that had a crazy effect. But in the end, as we came full circle, by the time the pandemic hit and it had sunk in, and Trump came to the realization that his good friend Xi Jinping had lied to him when he said the virus was under control and that he didn't have anything to worry about. At that point, this was the hardliners' chance to push forward all of these things at the end of the administration that they had been holding on to for 4 years. And because these strategy documents had laid the groundwork for that, that became a lot easier. And all they had to do was take all of these things off the shelf. Now, the fact that they did it at the end in a rush during a pandemic also undermined its effectiveness, because these things weren't sustainable, because they weren't, done in a competent way. And like when Pompeo, just look at the Taiwan thing, he, okay, we have no more restrictions on travel to Taiwan. And then, the Biden administration has to come in and clean all that stuff up, and they have to check all of that work. And that speaks to the coronavirus origin story too, which we can talk about. So it's not correct to say that these strategy documents were useless. They were actually very important. They just weren't important to Trump. But in the end, they turned out to be the hardliners' vehicle for getting a lot of stuff done that we still see in our policy today.
Well, I think there's another version of your book, or at least a chapter, that probably could well be titled "Unbeknownst to Trump," using your phrase, which described really what happened. Hey, look, you did refer to the previous president's lack of understanding of alliances and ill treatment of alliances.
Yeah.
If there has been one fundamental shift, it's that you've heard U.S. diplomats now for the last 3 months repeatedly use the term alliance first. So there has been a shift, at least in terms of how policy towards China is coordinated. Give us your take on the first 100 days of the Trump administration's policy towards, the Biden administration's policy towards China, where you think it's going, and what we should be watching as it continues to develop.
Right. I mean, it's just a tragic shame that, as the Trump administration turned United States towards a more focused China policy, or a more competitive or confrontational China policy, that it attacked alliances at the same time almost constantly. Australia was by no means immune from this, as you well know. I mean, I remember it was 2 years before they named a U.S. ambassador to Australia, and then they named Harry Harris, and that was a crazy story, by the way, because that almost didn't happen. And and then they pulled him to make him U.S. ambassador to South Korea, and it took another year to get somebody else, and that was only one of the many slights. I remember being in South Korea with Mark Esper, where he's praising the strength of the U.S.-South Korean relationship, and on CNN, on the TV behind us, everyone's watching Trump blackmail South Korea for $5 billion of basing, something, because he got the idea in his head that they owed us 5 times the amount that they owed us, and the stories went on and on and on and on and on. And so, I think, there was a huge weakness and huge failure of the Trump administration to do that. And quite tragically, this whole issue became framed in the international community as a spat between the U.S. and China, rather than an international response to China's actions as it rises, right? Which is what I think it really is. Now, the Biden team, they came in with alliances first for 2 reasons, right? One, because it's like the low-hanging fruit. The easiest thing to do is to, if you're in a hole, is to stop digging. Right. So it's a very simple thing to go around and reassure all of these allies that, America's back, that we're not going to start a trade war with you at the same time we start a trade war with your adversaries, that we're not going to impose punitive damage on the relationship for no reason whatsoever, which is just a stupid thing to do strategically. And also because they were trying to give the Beijing the cold shoulder on purpose. And they wanted to under the guise of, we're coordinating our strategy with our allies, to play coy and to play footsie with the Chinese leadership, so that they would have to come to us. So that that's why they wanted them to come to DC. Well, they wouldn't come. Okay, well, they came to Alaska. That's still America. We got them, right? And that's the kind of games that they were playing. But it's also, the second reason was also because they didn't know what they wanted to do. And if you look at the top ranks of the Biden administration, who are the China hands? Can you find any? I can't find any. Even Kirk Campbell's not really a China hand, right? He's more of a Japan hand than anything else. He's an alliance guy, right? These are the people. So the personalities drive the policy. So it's very natural that they went around. The first thing that they did was, we'll go around and shore up all of our alliances. But it's also because they're engaged in this review. And, one of the refreshing things about the Trump administration was that, anything could happen on any day, which would mean they didn't care about process, right? And if you've lived in Washington, I've lived in Washington for 23 years now. In the end, process is the least important thing. Well, in Congress and policy, what matters is what happens and what people get done and what people say and do and how they treat each other. And the process is always was always the most horrible part of the reporting. It's always the most boring stuff. And that's the part that the Biden Obama people love. They just love that process. So they started a bunch of processes to review everything. And, you could forgive them for like looking at that genocide designation, which was made literally on the last day of the administration, and to say, okay, we got to look at that. We got to take a look at that and see what's what before we endorse it. But they had to come out for it because of the political dynamic that we just mentioned. Same thing with the Confucius Institutes, the Huawei sanctions, the commerce designations, any part of this relationship, they're going to have to give it a thorough going over. But what happens in the Obama administration, what I see happening now in the Biden administration, is that the process becomes the thing. It becomes like a self-licking ice cream cone, a system that's sole purpose is to perpetuate its own existence. And once they start a process, it never ends. And they're like, oh, well, we can't answer any of your tough questions because we're still in the process, but we'll answer the questions we want to answer. And the process becomes an alibi for not doing anything. And that's what we're getting to in the China issue, also in North Korea, by the way. And that's really problematic because in the long run, we're all dead, right? They've got 4 years. We're 4 months in now. Okay, how long is this process going to take? How long before you tell us? Are you going to, would we defend Taiwan in the case of a contingency? Well, if you asked, Tony Blinken was asked that on Meet the Press. He's like, right? Because they don't know. They're still thinking about it, okay? What are we going to do about the 2022 Olympics? Well, that's a long way away. Okay, well, it's not that long. It's just next year. It's really not that long away. So all of these things are sort of in limbo, but in the pure Obama-Biden tradition, it just becomes a glut. And I think that's what we're saying.
Well, I'm gonna go right to the heart of the matter and ask you to help me understand something I haven't quite been able to understand. We have a good friend here named Major General Jeff Sengelman, who's participated in our several defense conferences, et cetera. And he used the same phrase that you use, which is a self-licking ice cream cone. And I don't understand what that means. What is a self-licking ice cream cone?
A self-licking ice. So this is like a phrase that I borrowed from like the Truman era, which when people used to, the quintessential example is the military-industrial complex. In other words, a system whose chief goal is to perpetuate its own existence, and then it becomes consumed with keeping itself alive rather than solving the problem that it was built to solve. And so you could think of the military-industrial complex or the system of defense companies that way. It's like their main job is to keep themselves in power and in the money, and that's what a self-licking ice cream cone is. But you see them all over Washington. It's just people, if you build it, they will come, and we're going to set up a review, and then we're going to have a consultation with the allies, and then we're going to review the consultation. Then we're going to set up some IPCs, that's agency policy committee meetings. Then we're going to have some DCs. That's deputy committee. Then we're going to have a PC, that's a principals committee meeting. Then we're going to have a decision memo. Then we're going to try to reach consensus. By the time you do that, like the whole administration's over. Okay. And this is like, I'll give you a good example in the US-China relationship of the self-licking ice cream cone, what we used to call the strategic and economic dialogues. Okay. Now these were in the Clinton era with and even before that, I think Hank Paulson really started them in the George W. Bush era, where these were seen as a panacea, right? If we could just get 400 US officials and 400 Chinese officials in the same hotel for 3 days and have 400 meetings, something's got to shake out of that. That's going to be great, right? We're going to have some real conversations, right? And, when the Trump people came in, the first thing that Navarro and Bannon and Pottinger said to Trump was like, don't do that. Don't set up this endless series of like complicated interactions that is just essentially a delay tactic for the CCP as they tap us along and pursue their aggression, and we're waiting on the process to finish. And of course, Trump's like, okay. And then he gets to Mar-a-Lago, and that's exactly what he does. Now, it didn't work because the Trump administration was too dysfunctional to even pull that off. So they didn't actually do that. But that they announced it, they just didn't do it. So, that's the self-licking ice cream cone. It's this idea that if we just build all these mechanisms into the US-China relationship, that's somehow going to result in the Chinese government realizing that it's in their interest to do things that they don't think it's in their interest to do now. And the basic premise of the Trump administration, one thing that I think the Pottingers of the world got right, which is that, no, they're not going to change just because we ask or because we think they should, or because we're not going to be able to convince them of what's in their interest. We're going to either have to realize that they're going to do what they think is in their interest, or if we want them to change their behavior, we're going to have to increase the pressure and increase the cost. And that's a risky, complicated thing to think about because it's never been done with a country this big, this powerful, this rich, that's intertwined into our society and into our industries the way that it is. And that's that was the flipping over of the chessboard, right? And then, but the problem is that there was so much chaos they couldn't set the chessboard back up again. That's what the Biden administration is trying to do right now.
Well, I understand the concept. I appreciate that in great detail. But as somebody who doesn't drink or smoke or even do coffee, ice cream is my principal vice.
I see.
Ice cream connoisseur, the concept of a self-licking ice cream cone seems to me to be horrendous at best.
Yes, it's a cautionary. It's not supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to be something that you're not supposed to strive for. So.
Look, it's already been 7 years since I was able to see you weekly, if not daily, in Washington, D.C. as you did your rounds. I don't feel too distant because obviously I see you on TV with regularity. You're frequently interviewed. Your writings are incredible. And I've also had a chance to kind of cross paths with you everywhere from the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore to the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue here in Australia, back in the United States. So I wonder if I can turn your attention to Australia, because I know you've spent a little time thinking on that. We've had a bit of a rough year. You referenced Kurt Campbell, who is the Indo-Pacific czar in the White House. There was tremendous relief, joy, if you will, in Canberra and in Australia more broadly about a month ago when Kurt came out and said quite definitively that there could be no improvement in the U.S.-China relationship as long as China continued to punish or attack Australia economically. But we have had a bit of a rough run here. There have been official and unofficial Chinese trade sanctions on barley, on crayfish, on a whole range of our economic goods that have impacted us greatly. I'm curious as to how you see the Australia-China relationship, and more importantly, how you see the Biden administration's likely response to that going forward.
Sure, great question. First of all, I would start with the fact that the issue of sort of Chinese interference and influence operations was so thoroughly and extensively discussed and developed in Australia well before it ever was discussed or developed in the United States. And because Australia had been dealing with that issue and sort of how to think about its institutions being compromised by United Front figures, United Front money, and how to deal with its own Chinese diaspora community and its own ethnically Chinese population, and how to legislate that and make policy that was responsible policy about that, and the politics surrounding that all happened in Australia well before it happened in the United States. And in fact, a lot of the lessons learned, both good and bad on the Australian side, factored directly into what was going on in the United States during the Trump administration in a very direct and clear way. And that was that the Australians who worked on this on the anti-CCP side of that debate in Australia were interacting with the Trump administration people all the time. And when I wrote the book, I hired Alex Josk of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute as one of my researchers. I interviewed everyone from Clive Hamilton to John Fitzgerald to John Garneau. And, just reporting on Chinese influence operations was not something the American media was trained or able to do. And now, 4 years later, thanks to our Australian friends, we've learned a lot about it. And what's tragic is that I see the American political and media system going through making a lot of the same mistakes that the Australian system made, and failing to really learn the lessons about how do we talk about these things and how do we debate them in a respectful way, and how do we balance what are often competing interests. And we want to welcome Chinese people and Chinese students and Chinese exchanges in our country, but we don't want that engagement to be abused and to be used against us. And that's a complicated thing. And unfortunately, here in the United States, by and large, for those people, anyone who hasn't read my book is not really getting that, okay? And we're not dealing with it well. Now, when it comes to how the U.S. treats Australia, I was in Australia with Mike Pence on the way to APEC in 2018, and there he was giving basically the same message as Kurt Campbell, which is that America stands by your side, and we have to pool our strengths and our resources, and we can't be pushing back on CCP bad behavior one by one, and we're strength in numbers and position of strength. That was the same thing Mike Pence said when he met when I was with him in Australia and then in Papua New Guinea on that trip. But there weren't the resources behind it. It wasn't actually the policy. It was a lot of happy talk that wasn't backed by follow through. Okay, so that's what I'm waiting for Kurt Campbell. Like, where's the beef? Where's, no pun intended, where are the policies? Where's the investment? Where are the shifting of the actual military resources? in a way that makes a difference. And where's the, the actual, attention of the U.S. government? And Kirk Campbell is saying the right things, but he's not Secretary of State. And where's the Secretary of State? Well, he's in Brussels, okay, because he has other competing priorities. And, what is the president focused on? He's focused on his climate change summit. So it's not clear to me that China and Asia and the ever, the perennial pivot to Asia that we hear so much about, it's not clear that this is any different to me yet. I hope it will be different, okay? The other thing that's important, I think, to think about is that, when it comes to the punishment of Australia during the pandemic, which is like a really punitive and horrible thing, to kick a country's economy in the middle of a pandemic while they're down. What's important from when I think about that is the reason that they did it. And it wasn't, because the Chinese Communist Party was engaged in some sort of like pursuit of a better trade deal or something in the country's national security interest. It was because Australia had the audacity to call for an independent investigation of the coronavirus origins, right? Something that I write a lot about in my book, right? So that's not the party, playing, using its economic aggression to aid the country's interests. That's the party using economic aggression and coercion to defend the party's interests, to deflect the party from the political blame of having started the pandemic. And that tells you all you need to know about how China is interacting with the rest of the world. It's not really about, China's national interests. It's not about the supposed outrage of the 1.4 billion Chinese people who, are so angry at Australia for demanding an investigation into the COVID origins. This is the party protecting itself. So increasingly, they're making these audacious and really, drastic moves against major countries and minor countries, any country really, to advance their political agenda and defend their political interests. And that's not just Australia. That's, when they go to the Netherlands and they say, if you want your masks, you better shut up about the coronavirus, or do you want your masks or not? And the same thing with the vaccines. When they go to this is a real example. The Chinese government went to the government of Paraguay and they said, hey, we'll give you all the vaccines you're going to need. One thing, you have to drop your recognition of Taiwan. Right? And what does the Paraguayan government do? Because they're under huge political pressure. The government could be toppled for refusing life-saving vaccines that are being offered to them, that are being given to their neighbors. But they can't yield to the coercion because it's humiliating and it sets a horrendous precedent. And that after they do that, that government would just be owned by the CCP, and they can't stomach that either. So they're actually putting these countries in a horrible no-win position, and they're not getting what they want, and they're destroying their relationships. Again, not because they're doing things. I'm not saying it's not rational. It's very rational. It's just not rational in terms of China's interests. It's just about the party, and that tells you all you need to know about what's going on in Beijing.
And that's a really important thing to understand from an Australian perspective. There has been some pushback from our friends in Japan not to use the phrase punish, right? That Australia has been punished for its audacity rather than attacked.
That's the right word.
Yeah, and obviously that, because punishment implies supervisor position or parental position
I see.
And culpability on the Australian side. But you're spot on. That they have done that not in the Chinese national interest. By every assessment, Chinese economic attacks on Australia have had a deleterious effect on the Chinese economy.
Of course.
All other stuff. So it's not been in China's national interest. It's really been in the political interest of the party. And I do appreciate that distinction. Hey, look,
that's what we're
quickly running out of time. One of my favorite things to do can be called the Perth read of a book, not the Washington, D.C. read, right? The Washington, D.C. read is to pick up a book, go to the table of contents and find your name and read every reference to you in the book. But I like to look at that unique challenge that authors have in summing up, a remarkable piece in the final paragraph. And so I grabbed your book. I went to the very last page without realizing that I was looking at the acknowledgments rather than the final concluding chapter. And the last 3 weeks in your book was, I love you, which was a beautiful tribute to your wife. So well done. We loved you too, Josh. I did go back to find the actual conclusion. Let me read it back to you. You said, the precondition for grappling with the China challenge is admitting that the old policies have failed and the CCP's actions under Xi require a new response. All Americans should work to put aside their differences and come together with allies and partners to craft and mount that new response. Until that happens, the chaos under heaven is likely to only continue. Beautifully phrased. Let me ask you as a kind of final wrap-up question, and you've already alluded to this. Given what we've seen for the first 100 days of the Biden administration, given ongoing partisan divides, the remarkably continued influence of Donald Trump as an individual, as the Republican Party continues to kiss the ring and make their trips down to Mar-a-Lago, what are the chances of Americans putting aside their differences and coming together to work on this issue, and us moving beyond the self-licking ice cream cone, if you will?
Well, it's just a sad fact in Washington and in America that the China issue has become hyper-politicized by both the left and the right, and been abused, frankly, by both political parties to advance their own political agendas and protect their own interests and to attack the other one. And right now, neither party has calculated that solving this issue is more important than keeping the issue as a cudgel that they can beat their opponents with. And, the Trump administration in its final years was particularly egregiously guilty of this. And Donald Trump, once he realized that his friendship with Xi Jinping was not real and that Xi had lied to him about the coronavirus and that he had no more incentive in sticking to this phase one deal and that he couldn't sell it and that the coronavirus was tanking his election, he engaged in the kind of nativist, racist rhetoric that really drove the China issue into a realm of hyperpartisanship heretofore unseen. And that led Democrats to react, I think overreact in a sense, by painting the entire drive to confront the CCP's malign behavior, actions, and strategy as some sort of attack that fuels racism and hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And, what I say in every talk, and because I'm not a left guy, I'm not a right guy, me, I'm not a Trump guy, I'm not an anti-Trump guy. I just I'm just a reporter, and the whole book is based on the idea that, we just have to be honest and transparent and about the problem that we're facing. And, what I say, I've talked to Steve Bannon's podcast and I've talked to Morning Joe, and I say the same exact thing, which is that, we have to be able to, first of all, separate the idea of the CCP and the Chinese people, and that we cannot, allow our confrontation of the Chinese government or our competition with the Chinese government unfairly target ethnically Chinese and ethnically Asian and Asian Americans in our country, and that the rise of hate and violence against AAPI Americans and people all over the world is a real problem that we have to confront, but that can't distract us from the task at hand. And that, if we started with the overlap, the things that we all agree on, which is that, at the points that the Chinese Communist Party's behavior impacts our prosperity, our security, our freedom, and our public health, that we have to stand up to that and figure out ways to confront that. Well, that's a lot if we just started there, but it would take the political will of both sides to do so. And the end of the Trump administration actually gives us an opportunity to reset that. But already we're seeing in the Biden administration that neither party is ready to abandon its own parochial interests in a shared effort to think about how we can get at this problem. That's not to say a lot of people aren't working on it hard. We're just not there yet. And, if you think about it, in a case like the NBA, right, we can't leave our companies or our schools who are not foreign policy first organizations to deal with this on their own. And, American institutions guard their independence fiercely and rightly, but this is a problem that they need to work with the government on. So that's going to require a public-private conversation. It's going to require a left-right conversation. And it's not, to be honest with you, it's not happening. And, that's a tragedy, but, the only real solution is for, people to sort of step back from their biases and their political affiliations and, to realize that this is a once in a generation type of challenge that we're all going to have to deal with one way or the other. I'm hopeful, but not optimistic that that's what's going to take place.
Hopeful, but not optimistic. Josh, you used the phrase just a reporter. I'm reflecting back now in the 25 years I've known you. I don't think once I've had cause to think about whether or not you lean left or right. You are not just a reporter, but one of the best. And I really appreciate your analysis, your insights. For those who are watching again, Josh's book is Chaos Under Heaven. Now fading out my phone. Trump, Xi in the Battle for the 21st Century. Oh, there's the actual book. Look at that. Hold that up, looking good. Available on Amazon, bookshops near you, but really worth a read. Extremely readable, deeply insightful. and written by someone who is far more than just a reporter, because whether we're in Australia or whether we're in the United States, in Japan, throughout our region, we really do need more people who are willing to kind of look deeply into the trends that are described in this book, because they impact each and every one of us. So Josh, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the effort you put into writing the book and for sharing it with our listeners today. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Gordon, for hosting me. Thank you for your help all these years. And I hope to see you soon in Perth. And I hope to continue our discussion there.
Indeed. Thank you.